Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on our Fireside Chat today. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Julia Banks. Julia is an experienced business leader and company director, a former member of the Parliament of Australia, and a leadership, governance, risk, issues, and crisis management expert. Julia's extensive business experience includes positions such as General Counsel, Executive Director, Company Secretary and Head of Risk and Compliance for some of the world's most recognisable blue chip companies. Julia is currently the principal consultant in her own business, providing strategic and practical business advice and mentoring and coaching to business and individuals. Julia has successfully created and led corporate governance training programs, is an active mentor to aspiring leaders, and has authored several published opinion pieces. Julia is Special Advisor to Gender Equity Victoria, where her role supports the board and staff to develop policies and programs to support gender equity in all levels of government, and she's also an ambassador to Honour a Woman Australia. Julia's key areas of expertise and leadership experience are in the areas of governance, ethics, trust, reputation, risk, crisis and issues management, leadership development, and also workplace culture. Today, Julia and I are going to chat about Julia's life and work in both corporate space and politics, her leadership experience in crisis and risk management, and her advocacy for equal representation of women in leadership positions in both politics, business, and of course across all industry sectors. Julia Banks, a very, very warm welcome to you today, and thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Anne. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, let's go back just a little way, to sort of when you're a little girl and what you wanted to do and be when you grew up, and what was the driving force behind that?
Well, the driving force actually was a very practical one, and I always had it drummed into me from my mum in particular to always be financially independent. So no matter what job, even from a young age, I thought my job my interest had to have some vocational element that where I was going to, become financially independent. So I from quite a young age, I've always loved reading and writing and stories, and I wanted to be either a journalist or a lawyer. And I liked both of those because they involved writing, and I've always loved stories, particularly true stories. So I think obviously law, won out in the end, and I think that was probably again driven from that practical element that I felt there'd be greater job security at the time in terms of qualifying as a lawyer, as opposed to the career path for a journalist at the time.
Yeah. Fantastic. And I love that, your mother's advice was, around financial security. I think it's so important and relevant, particularly to women. And, it's still relevant today, making sure that women are financially independent.
It permeates every element of our life, and I think it's the core reason for gender inequality quite often in terms of the gender pay gap or in terms of women's career trajectories. So it is something that is absolutely core, and it's something that I've particularly during my time in politics, no matter the audience, but particularly young school groups, young girls, I would say, the transformative powers of education are enhanced even more, if you strive for financial independence. Yeah,
it's great advice. And I love the sort of, the relevance of storytelling to both journalism and also, to the legal world, because, both require a really good storyteller, both sort of trying to get to the truth of things, from a legal perspective or a journalistic perspective. So, the power of the voice. So, fantastic.
Yeah.
What have been some of the significant moments in your life that have sort of affected what you were doing today? I know that you made a significant change from the corporate world to the political world quite late in life
Yeah.
in terms of career changes.
Yeah.
And, I know that over the course of the last sort of 12 months or, certainly since COVID, you've been sort of penning a book. And, let's talk a little bit about what that looks like in terms of what the content is and when we can expect to sort of hopefully get a copy in our hands. But
Oh, right.
yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, I guess the significant changes again happened throughout. So I decided pretty early on in my career I didn't didn't enjoy being a lawyer in private practice. So I didn't, apologies to the lawyers listening, but I didn't like working with just lawyers all day. So I moved to the corporate world very early on because I loved that feeling of working in a business with the same business goal with people from cross-functional disciplines. I really enjoyed that. And, for the bulk of my life, I had spent my business career in corporate roles. But that being said, I also throughout my career, and it was not an aside, it was sort of integrated in my job, and in what I felt I had to contribute, and that was always being an advocate for gender equality, for gender and cultural equality, particularly in the workplace and workplace cultures. So I was always on diversity councils or committees or groups. And, back in the day, I was the strongest advocate to introduce maternity leave. Before, back in my day, it was, 12 months unpaid. I was a very strong advocate for that, and the organisation for which I worked brought it in then. So I've always been that advocate, and when the opportunity came up to when basically it came from a place of observation. I've never been involved in any sort of depth with a political party, very focused on my business career. But they were calling for more women, and I thought, well, I'll join up as a party, as a member, just to see what it was like. And before I knew it, I was being asked to run as a candidate for a seat that was unwinnable. But it was put to me as this is a good way of networking and getting to know people within the party. And so I did that, and then the unthinkable happened in that we won the seat, and not just the seat, but a seat that was regarded as unwinnable. It had been held by the opposition for 20 years. It was the one seat in the one seat majority. And so it was a career change very late in life, but nonetheless, it gave me that opportunity to be that advocate on that broad platform, not just on gender equality, but on issues that I think that I certainly care about, and most people do, in terms of climate change action and humanitarian issues. And so that was it was quite an interesting time to make that change so late.
Yeah, absolutely. And how did you, it's part of that change, because you actually did win a seat that was, considered to be non-winnable. So kudos and congratulations to you. I think it's fantastic. But how did you go about doing the transition from the corporate world to the government world? Because the two worlds are, from somebody looking from the outside in, look very, very different. So how did you go about doing, transitioning?
Well, they are very different worlds once you're in. But certainly my campaign, and I believe this was the success of my campaign, is that I ran the campaign according to the business model of getting a good team together. That's not always it's not an easy thing in politics, because you don't have the you basically have to exercise your leadership. So I basically created a micro team of people who I knew I could trust. And it was with that team and that, having that one goal. It's a very different thing managing volunteers compared to managing employees, people who you pay. So that is a very different thing. But once we won, again, it was, I liken it to being an MP of an electorate of 100,000 people. It was like starting up a new small business, because for me and my team, it was really a clean slate. There was no easy transition, or here are the books, here are the folders, here are the files. We literally had an empty office. We didn't even actually have an office, because the office normally comes across regardless of party, but our office was the office was completely dilapidated, and it was the opposition had been working out of temporary arrangements. So we had to find office staff, do all those things that you would do when you set up a business. So that's where the similarities are. The differences are in terms of the whole management and leadership structure. A leader of a political party doesn't have the power and control of what you think are their followers, the ministers or the members, that you would ordinarily in a business world. So it's a very different type of leadership, and it's a very different way to work. Which plays out in the media. In terms of, like, anyone who's ever been a leader in a corporation knows that teamwork delivers success. The Australian public have been eyewitnesses to decided lack of teamwork more often than not in the political realm. Yeah.
You've also sort of, in the sort of the political arena, but also outside the political arena, you've also had sort of quite a strong voice in terms of gender equity across businesses.
Yeah.
And, you talk, sort of advocate the importance of having quotas, particularly from a government perspective. Just talk to me a little bit about, how you see that working, and based on your experience, are the outcomes better by having a balanced sort of view in terms of gender equity?
Yeah, sure. So again, I had spent the better part of 20 years working in large matrix organizations where you see leaders come and go, rotate quite frequently in terms of CEOs and the leadership groups. I saw businesses literally transformed when they put a sort of mandate or incentivized CEOs and leaders to balance their leadership teams if there was a gender imbalance. So, for example, if you see had a leadership team of 10 men and 2 women, and then that leader is incentivized by way of their bonus and their KPIs, the CEO, to balance that out and then see the outcome of that balance. It's quite extraordinary to see the transformative powers of balance, gender equal leadership teams. I mean, the business case has been made time and time again. ASIC's, listed companies, research has been done which shows that businesses are more profitable if they have a gender equal leadership team, and that is it is not surprising, because with a gender equal leadership team you have that diversity of views, and it makes sense because 51% of our population is female, and I've seen you're able to implement targets in the business context because you can link it to incentives, but you obviously can't have targets in politics. You need a hard quota, and the Labor Party have proven that with a quota system, I think they're up to 46%. And the government, the Liberal Party, obviously haven't done that, and that's the reason on world standards we are lagging behind. We're still ranked up in the 50s in terms of gender equal leadership. And so with that, you see policies, the policy outcomes invariably are not satisfactory outcomes, because the policy outcomes, it's almost blind. There's been a lot of discussion about the fact that the budget for 2020 was gender blind
Yep.
to women, which make up 51% of our population. So I'm very strong about quotas. There are quotas already in existence in terms of the makeup of the party by way of geography, by way of the Nationals versus the Liberals, but there's not a quota in relation to gender, and there absolutely should be.
Mm.
Yeah.
Let's just talk through one of the reasons why you sort of got out of politics, and maybe, from a leadership perspective, when you and I first met, you had just sort of come out of politics, and you weren't on social media or anything like that because of the challenges associated with being, a public face and
Yeah.
social media. So there's sort of two angles in there, but let's just sort of quickly touch on why you left politics, and then some of the challenges from a social media perspective, etc., associated with the role.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I left. The reasons that I left the party were pretty well documented in terms of, was basically, I don't think you can work for any employer or organisation if your values aren't aligned. And my values had not changed, but theirs obviously had, which it was demonstrated throughout, but reached a peak point during the coups. So, and given the treatment I received thereafter, I decided, well, if I'm to exit this place, I'll exit on a principled position in terms of, what, and say the reason why I'm exiting, and I certainly put that forward. And becoming an independent it restored my faith in democracy, in the sense, and that might sound like a lofty statement, but it restored my belief in the power of people versus the party. In a relatively short time, the support of the local community in terms of the issues that they cared about, it was quite extraordinary. And I think more and more people are wanting that sort of politician who is loyal to their community or loyal to the people, as opposed to the party. And so that was a sort of a great time. Now, obviously, we didn't win the election, but I always believe there is another way. There's always another way to advocate. And so I took a gap year at the end of the sort of kind of a gap year in that sense, but basically thought, whatever I do next, I want it to be useful and go to the work I've done, previously, and that is in relation to advocating for equal representation for men and women in the workplace. And so I'm penning the book, as you mentioned, Anne, and the book is sort of part memoir. Like, I love the power of stories, particularly true stories. So I thought I will use those stories to demonstrate and to, it's sort of part memoir, part useful resource guide for men and women who aspire to leadership positions, in terms of navigating through bias, barriers, discrimination, in terms of, doing those things, rather than sort of saying blame culture and this is the way it is and it's all awful, but basically saying, look, here's the path that you can take. Very different. There multiple paths that people can take towards leadership positions, and that's what I hope, that's my goal with the book. Yeah
Awesome. And is the book sort of like, schoolgirls leaving, school at the age of 18, and then, looking to start their career, and don't really understand a lot about leadership and what does that mean? Is the book going to be sort of applicable to anybody at any age?
No, it's not actually, because I've targeted through the decades, if you like, in terms of issues that can impact people. I mean, obviously, everyone's life experience is different, but if people can take, one thing out of each decade that might apply to them, that's the aim of the book. That it covers that whole gamut of experience, and right into the your 50s, as you mentioned, I made the move into politics literally in my early 50s, and that was a career change that happened then, and so that's why I sort of make sure it covers from the teenage girls that I've spoken to in my entire adult life, certainly in the senior at times of my career, right through to 50s and beyond,
Yeah,
looking
great.
at the advice of others. Yeah,
Awesome. Over the course of the last sort of 7 to 9 months, we've experienced a crisis like no other, and hopefully we'll not experience again in our lifetime anyway. One of the, things that you've done previously in the corporate world is sort of around governance and crisis management, and
yeah.
no doubt managed multiple crises within organisations. What, from your perspective, do you think are the key elements when, people are managing a crisis? Because I'm quite sure that there are a number of organisations out there that were caught off guard. But also, this crisis, some days you just don't know what you should be doing.
Sure.
Because everything changes so quickly, and
Yeah.
nobody's been in this sort of situation before.
Yeah.
So what would be, from your perspective, the key elements around managing a crisis?
Well, I think the two key things are obviously governance. I think governance and communication. I think they're the two issues in any crisis management field. Now, over the years, I've managed from the smallest product recall, which is classified as issues management, to getting employees safely out of New Zealand post the Christchurch earthquake or 9/11. So every crisis is different, and there's one thing's for sure in a crisis, and that is expect the unexpected. And people from across Australia, around the world, obviously, imagine their different micro crises as it's tailored to their respective businesses, for example, and things affect different businesses in different ways. There would be commonalities, but very, very different things happen. And part of governance is preparedness. That's a really big factor in terms of crisis management, but this obviously took many people by surprise. And so at the other end of the spectrum, in terms of, which I think is so critical and so important, which we've all still got a chance to do and to do well, and that is an after action review. And I've seen so many crisis management matters where the last thing the executive team want to do is review what they did. And I'm sure most people are COVID fatigued, like they're over it, they just want to get on with it. But it would be very valuable for any business to look at what they did well, what they could have done better, to spend that time so that they're, to basically bring to life and add substance to their crisis management plan. And I think it's imperative on us in the world in which we currently live, particularly because of COVID, but even for boards across Australia, just pre-COVID, many businesses were grappling with the Black Summer bushfires and the impact that had on their business. So those two elements are really a really critical part of crisis management. But the elements of communication, you can never do enough communication, be that to any stakeholders, to your clients, customers, but to your employees. You can't over communicate in a crisis. And there's a necessity for authenticity and compassion, which we've seen the greatest leaders in COVID have all those factors. In terms of compassion and courage. And courage, I say courage because one of the hardest things for any leader in crisis management is the decision making. And perfection is the enemy of good. And I believe every leader would have made mistakes. And the important thing is mistakes in decisions. And the important thing is to go back and address it, or to be upfront about it and recognize that you are making these decisions, but the necessity is the gift of time. You don't have the gift of time quite often in crisis management. I once worked with a leader. He was a global leader of the organisation, and we were doing a debrief with him of a major crisis that impacted us. And he said, and I've never forgotten his words, he said, look, I get it. If you're in the middle of managing a crisis and you don't know what to do next, or what to decide next, wait 10 minutes. And, that sums up, I think, the world we've all been faced with of late.
Yeah, it's so true. And talking of advice, it's a nice segue in actually. What, in terms of your sort of own career and growth and everything, what's some of the best advice somebody's given to you, and what impact, has it had on you and your sort of choices moving forward?
Yeah. One that always comes back to me, and it was pretty early-ish in my career, and I was headhunted for a really big job, and it was for an ASX listed company, and it was a really fancy job, and I went through the interview process ultimately with the CEO, and there were obviously only a few people I could tell it about and tell about it, and I rang a friend who lives overseas, and I was telling him about the job and everything, and I said, but there's this thing, that CEO, there's something I just didn't like about him. I'm not sure if I can work with, and I was trying to rationalize the whole process. And he said, well, there's your answer. And I said, what do you mean? He said, if you don't feel comfortable taking this job because of him, if that's what your gut's telling you, rely on your instinct. That's your answer. And I went down that path. I remember, still being a bit ambivalent, and have I let go of a perfect opportunity? And a couple of months later, that organisation was in the paper for all the wrong reasons. And I've always lived with that always trust your instincts. Good leaders rely on their instincts, and I think that's particularly so during COVID as well. That your instincts rarely let you down, and I think it was always a good piece of advice that I've held with me forever.
Great advice. And I think that sometimes you get lost in the opportunity, or you get lost in the what did you call it, fancy job, and you sort of you tend to forgive things that you wouldn't normally forgive because I really want the job. But really, 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 really good advice. One of the things that you've sort of, I think you've picked up over the last sort of year or so, is that you've become a special advisor to Gender Equity Victoria. So just talk us through what you're actually doing, and how is that going to help our gender equality in government moving forward?
Yeah, so the first and most attractive thing about it is that it is bipartisan. It doesn't have a partisan influence. So, so we're basically special advisor for, and they've got a section for women in politics, women in the media, women in sport. And it's really doing that deep dive look into how we can make the world better, and have more equal representation in all those areas across the board, and really looking at things, for example, like the gendered abuse that women particularly receive in social media and other forms of media, not just social media. Quite often it's the harder forms of media that incite or create a greater sort of volume of negative social media. So that's where the focus is, and that segues beautifully into what I like to do, what I love to do, and in terms of contributing to hopefully making the world a better place in terms of a more gender equal place.
Yeah. And I know that from a leadership perspective and, the importance of gender equality across organisations, from your perspective, what are the gains to be had? From your experience, what have you seen the gains are by having a diverse, whether it's a board or a diverse executive team or management team or, diversity all the way through an organisation, really?
Yeah. Look, I think it's the devil's in the detail, but basically, if you have a policy outcome, a business policy or a business strategy that is created with a gender equal leadership team, your outcome is going to be better, and that's ultimately better for business. And that time and time again, research has come out and made the business case that businesses are more profitable if they have gender equality at the leadership levels. And I think, our population, our society is calling out for that. And that's why good businesses, or strategic businesses, are actually doing substantial and making, structural changes to their businesses, implementing things such as hard targets, implementing workplace structures and workplace cultural structures to ensure that they have that gender equal leadership team, because the proof's in the pudding. They see their counterparts being more successful, and the research is showing that it's because they have that diversity of voices and impact on their businesses.
Yeah, so important, isn't it? And such a long way to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, so, during COVID and everything, what is sort of, what have you been up to? I mean, I know you sort of, been penning a book, and that's probably been incredibly time consuming, but how have you sort of managed during COVID-19?
I guess, like a lot of people, I've made sure I've kept a routine. I've kept the exercise up to, probably much better than I would have done pre-COVID. So I've managed to focus on that. But and I didn't bake bread, but I do love cooking. So I did a lot of that. But call me shallow, but one thing I really, really miss is going out for dinner with friends. I just, as much as I love cooking,
Yeah, there's only so much you
there's
can
so
do,
much in
isn't
my
there?
own cooking. So,
Yeah.
and seeing other humans and being, beyond, as much as I love my family, seeing other humans beyond my family, and socializing with them. And what I really miss is hugs, that sort of human contact stuff that you just would never think is taken away from you. But
Yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting. It's the things that you never give a second thought to in your day-to-day life. And
Yeah.
yeah, I know that in terms of, things that you don't take for granted, definitely hugging. And we've had a couple of people say their health, that they would never take their health for granted again,
Yeah.
uh, which is really relevant. But I think the whole family thing, like my daughter lives in England,
Yeah.
and she won't get home for Christmas this year. She was due to come home earlier this year, and in March actually, because my niece was getting married. So she didn't
Right.
come home. My niece didn't get married, and
Oh.
she's just had her ticket completely cancelled. So I'm assuming I probably won't see her until the back end of next year. So that'll
Wow.
be nearly 3 years since I will have seen her. So it's things like
That's
that
so tough.
yeah, it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you just sort of like, wow, it's just sort
Mm.
of, life changing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just sort of, my closest friend's father sadly passed away, not of COVID, but during lockdown, and not being able to hug her, to support her during that time, and the limit on funerals, and it was just, it's just affected so many people in so many ways, and the world will never be the same. And I think it's quite interesting how it sort of defines humanity in terms of what's important, in life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I would like to think that we'll be a far more empathetic society as we come out the other side of it than perhaps we were
Yes.
pre-COVID. So,
Yeah.
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 Julia Banks, thank you so much for joining our fireside chat today. It's just
It's a
such a
pleasure,
delight
Anne,
to talk to
always.
you, incredibly insightful.
Thanks.
And yeah, all the very best. And I look forward to being able to catch up with you in a real, over a cup of coffee.
Sounds
Monday.
great.
So,
I
yeah,
look forward to that.
me
In
too.
a real Melbourne cafe.
That's right.
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it does. So Julia Banks, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much, Anne. It's been a pleasure.